The captive nurse just grabbed a heavy revolver and blew out the kneecap of a Mafia boss to save the man who kidnapped her. This explosive moment proves that we don't belong to the ledgers of powerful men. We forge our own destinies when we refuse to be victims. Love fierce women who fight back? Share this with a friend. Drop a like and subscribe for more intense drama.
2:47 a.m. The basement parking garage of Collins Capital Group on Wacker Drive. The air down here tasted like damp concrete, exhaust fumes, and the sharp, metallic bite of a coming Chicago winter. Clara Miller was flat on her stomach beneath a black Lincoln Navigator. Her chest heaved against the cold oil-stained floor. She pressed the palm of her right hand over her mouth, biting down on her own skin to stifle the sound of her breathing. In her left hand, her knuckles were white around a tiny silver USB drive. It felt heavier than it looked. Above her, a dying fluorescent bulb hummed, flickering in a slow, agonizing rhythm. Click, click, click. Leather soles on concrete. Regular, measured, unhurried. 3 pairs of shoes. They weren't rushing because they didn't need to. They knew the exits were locked. They knew she was a civilian. They were just closing the net, enjoying the hunt. Clara closed her eyes. Her mind flashed to the sterile, chaotic warmth of the Cook County ER just 6 hours ago. She was a trauma nurse. She knew how bodies broke. She knew how blood pooled. But she had never expected her own life to be the one on the operating table. 6 hours earlier, the ER was a war zone. Clara moved between beds with a practiced, rhythmic calm. She was stabilizing a young kid from the south side with a nasty stab wound to the abdomen. Her hands were steady as she applied pressure. Her voice a low, soothing anchor against the boy's panic. Her nursing clogs were scuffed and stained. Her blue scrubs had been washed so many times the fabric was tissue, thin. She was 34, and she was profoundly, structurally exhausted. It wasn't the kind of tired a night of sleep could fix. It was the weariness of a woman who had spent years fighting a system designed to crush people like her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A private number. She stepped into the hallway and answered. It was her father, Arthur. His voice didn't sound like a retired machinist anymore. It sounded small, broken. Clara. They here, he whispered. Men in dark suits. They standing on the porch. They have papers, sweetheart. They say a private equity fund bought out my cancer treatments. The outstanding balance, they leveraging the house. They're taking it. A 340 medical bill for stage 2 gastric cancer. Clara had pulled double shifts for 3 years, stripping her own life to the bone to pay off 280 of it. But the system didn't care about effort, it cared about margins. A predatory shell company had bought the remaining debt, and they wanted it all in 72 hours. Or her father was on the street. Don't open the door, Dad, she had whispered, her throat tight. I'm coming. She left her shift early. She didn't go home. Instead, she went straight to Logan Square, to a cramped apartment smelling of stale takeout and burning circuits. Ray Delgado, a rogue coder she'd known since her university days, was her only shot. She needed him to find out who really owned the debt. Ray's fingers had flown across 3 monitors. It took him 20 minutes to peel back the corporate layers. It's a ghost network. Clara, Ray said, his face pale under the glow of the screens. The fund is a shell, owned by another shell, but the apex, it all roots back to Collins Capital Group, the architect's place. Everyone in Chicago knew about Vance the architect Collins. He was the city's polite monster. He didn't execute people on street corners. He suffocated them with real estate contracts and laundered billions through legitimate corporate infrastructure. But then Ray's screen glitched. A massive, encrypted file started downloading automatically. Ray had tripped a silent alarm in the Collins server. Oh, God, Ray whispered, staring at the data stripping across his monitor. This isn't just debt collection, Clara. This is a master ledger, offshore accounts, bribes, payoff receipts for half the zoning boards and politicians in Illinois. This is the structural glue of the whole city. Before Ray could abort, heavy footsteps thundered in the hallway outside. The wooden frame of Ray's front door splintered with a deafening crack. 2 men in tailored gray suits stepped through the smoke. Ray didn't hesitate. He ripped the USB drive from his tower, shoved it into Clara's hand. and pushed her toward the fire escape. "Run," he screamed. "Don't go back to your dad's. Just run." And she had run. She had used every shortcut she knew from growing up on the south side narrow alleys. Cut-throughs behind train platforms. The dark arteries of a city that didn't care if she lived or died. By pure, desperate irony. She had run toward the one place she thought they wouldn't look for a fugitive. The corporate headquarters of Collins Capital, itself on Wacker Drive. She thought a 42-story skyscraper would be empty at 2 in the morning. She was wrong. She had slipped through a service entrance, taken the private elevator straight to the executive floor, and burst into the main office, gasping for air, her hair soaked with autumn rain. The room was vast, dark, and dead quiet. A single man stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass wall, looking out at the black, sluggish ribbon of the Chicago River. He wore a crisp white shirt, the top buttons undone, his silk tie loosened. He held a glass of amber scotch. The ice completely melted. Vance Collins. He didn't startle. He didn't draw a weapon. He slowly turned his head, his dark eyes fixing onto her. Vance Collins didn't survive 28 years at the top of a syndicate by being reactive. He survived by reading people like text. He looked at Clara, her breathing ragged, her eyes wide with the raw, unmistakable terror of a civilian who had stumbled into hell, and he knew instantly she wasn't an assassin. "You're bleeding," Vance said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone, entirely devoid of emotion. Clara looked down at her arm, a deep scrape from the fire escape. She hadn't even felt it. "I don't care." Behind him, a side door opened. Gary Boyd, Vance's right-hand man, stepped in, his hand already inside his jacket. His radio buzzed with static. "Boss," Gary said, his eyes locking onto Clara. "Security downstairs just reported an anomaly. Silas Vance's crew just breached the lower garage. They've bypassed our perimeter. They're hunting someone." Vance didn't look at Gary. He kept his eyes on Clara. He saw the way her fingers clutched the silver drive. He saw the sheer, defiant exhaustion in her posture. She was terrified, yes, but she wasn't breaking. Vance set his scotch glass down on the mahogany desk. The click of the crystal against wood was the loudest sound in the room. He stepped closer to her, his long strides deliberate. Up close, he smelled of cedarwood, expensive tobacco, and something cold and metallic, like old coins. He looked past her, out the glass doors toward the elevator bank, then back to the security monitors on the wall. The feed showed 3 of Silas's men moving through the lower levels with suppressed weapons. Vance reached out, his large, scarred hand adjusting the gold cufflink on his left wrist. He didn't look angry. He looked like an engineer looking at a faulty blueprint. He looked at Gary, his face settling into a mask of absolute, deadly calm. "Gary," Vance whispered, the sound vibrating in the quiet room. "Who gave them permission to touch what belongs in my house?" Clara felt a chill run straight down her spine. She didn't know the politics of the city's underworld, but she knew human nature. Vance Collins wasn't asking a question. He was making a declaration. By entering his space, by bringing her survival into his world, she had ceased to be an intruder. She had become his variable, and Vance Collins controlled every variable. The silence in the room didn't just sit there. It suffocated. Vance Collins stood perfectly still. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, built like the concrete pillars holding up his empire. His eyes stayed on Clara. They were dark, unreadable, and completely steady. Gary didn't move his hand from his jacket. He waited for a command. One word from Vance, and Clara knew she would disappear into the Chicago night, a footnote in a ledger nobody would ever read. Clara didn't look at Gary. She didn't look at the security monitors showing the armed men downstairs. She looked at Vance. Her knees were shaking inside her thin scrubs, but she forced her spine to lock. She had spent 12 years dealing with erratic, violent people in the trauma bay. Fear was a luxury. Panic was a liability. "You have something that doesn't belong to you," Vance said. His voice was too quiet, too controlled. "I have the ledger," Clara said. Her voice cracked slightly, but she cleared her throat and pushed through it. "Your ledger. The one Silas Vance's people are willing to kill for." Vance's left eyebrow twitched, a fraction of an inch. It was the only sign that she had surprised him. "You re a civilian. You don't know what that data means." "I know it means leverage," Clara replied. She held up the silver USB drive between her thumb and forefinger. Her hand was trembling, but her grip was tight. I don't care about your politics. I don't care about your money. I want my father's debt wiped. Completely. I want the deed to his house back in his name, cleared of all liens, by tomorrow morning. And I want your word that your collectors will never look at his street again. Gary let out a short, dry sound. It wasn't a laugh. It was the sound a wolf makes before it tears into a rabbit. You re-bargaining. Look around you, lady. You in the lioness den. And the door is locked from the outside. Let her speak, Gary. Vance murmured. He took 2 steps toward her. The air in the room seemed to compress with his movement. He stopped just 2 feet away. He was close enough that Clara could see the faint, jagged white scar running along his jawline. $600,000, Vance said softly. That's what your father owes my subsidiary. You think a tiny piece of plastic is worth $600,000. I know it's worth your life, Clara said, looking straight into his eyes. Because if Silas gets it, he won't just take your money, he'll take your head. 600,000 is a discount, Mr. Collins. Do we have a deal or not? For 3 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Clara forgot to breathe. Then, the corner of Vance's mouth tugged upward. It wasn't a warm smile, it was a cold, appreciative glint. It was the look of a grand master recognizing a clever opening move from an opponent he had completely underestimated. Give me the drive, Vance said, extending a large palm. When the paperwork is signed, Clara countered. Vance's hand remained open in the air. The paperwork takes time. The threat downstairs is happening right now. Gary, take her up to the penthouse. Use the private service elevator. Secure the perimeter. He turned back to Clara, his voice dropping an octave. You stay here until my people verify the encryption on that drive. If it's real, your father is a free man. If it's a bluff, well, you won't have to worry about the debt anymore. The penthouse on the 60th floor was an architectural marvel and a psychological graveyard. Clara stood in the center of the massive living room. Her muddy clogs left a trail of dark Chicago slush across the pristine, white Calacatta marble floor. She felt an instinctual urge to bend down and wipe it away, the ingrained habit of a working-class woman who cleaned up after herself, but she stopped. She wasn't a servant here, she was a captive. She looked around. The space was beautiful, designed by an elite eye, but it was entirely hollow. The lights were automated, casting a soft, amber glow that looked like candlelight but felt like ice. There were no family photographs on the mantel, no dog-eared books on the side tables. The massive Sub-Zero refrigerator in the kitchen was stocked with identical bottles of sparkling water and pre-packaged corporate catering. But there wasn't a single crumb of actual life on the counters. It wasn't a home. It was a fortress built to keep the world out, or to keep a man in. Gary stood by the reinforced steel door, his arms crossed over his chest. He watched her like a hawk watching a field mouse. 20 minutes later, the door chimed. Vance walked in. He had removed his jacket, rolling his shirt sleeves up to his elbows, revealing thick, muscular forearms corded with veins. He looked tired, but his posture was still rigid. He didn't acknowledge her footprints on his expensive floor. Instead, he carried a small silver tray from the kitchen elevator and set it on the marble island. On it was a bowl of hot chicken broth and a sandwich wrapped in artisanal paper. Eat, Vance said. I am not hungry, Clara lied. Her stomach rumbled instantly, loud enough to echo in the cavernous room. Your body is in shock, Vance said, his tone entirely pragmatic. Your adrenaline is bottoming out. If you don't put fuel in your system, you're going to pass out on my floor. And I don't have the patience to carry you to a bed. Eat. Clara hesitated, then walked over to the island. She sat on the leather bar stool and picked up the sandwich. She ate quickly, trying to maintain whatever dignity she had left. Vance watched her from across the counter, his dark eyes analyzing the way she held her jaw, the way her eyes darted to the exits. You a trauma nurse, Vance stated. It wasn't a question. Yes, she said between bites. Cook County ER, why aren't you a doctor? Clara stopped chewing. She looked at him, her eyes narrowing. Because medical school takes 4 years. Residency takes another 3 to 5. And my father got sick when I was 22. He needed an income immediately. He didn't have 12 years for me to become a luxury brand. Mr. Collins, he needed groceries next Tuesday. Vance didn't flinch at her sarcasm. He nodded once, slowly. A structural necessity. You adjusted your timeline to fit the survival of the unit. I understand that. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black smartphone, sliding it across the marble toward her. The screen showed a digitized legal document with a certified digital signature from the state treasury. Arthur Miller's account with Collins Capital is closed, Vance said. The lien on the Bridgeport property has been dissolved. The title is clean. You can check the county database yourself. Clara stared at the screen. The breath rushed out of her lungs all at once. The crushing, suffocating weight that had lived on her chest for 3 years suddenly vanished. She wanted to cry, but she forced the tears back down. Thank you, she whispered. She pushed her half-eaten sandwich away. Then I'll be going now. She started to stand, but Vance didn't move. He simply leaned his weight against the counter. You aren't going anywhere, Miss Miller. Clara's hand instinctively went to her pocket, but her phone was gone. Gary had taken it downstairs. We had a deal. You got the drive. My father is clear. The deal was for the debt, Vance said, his voice deadly calm. It wasn't for your exit visa. Silas Vance's men saw you enter my building. They know your face. They know you left Logan Square with something valuable. If you walk out those front doors right now, you won't make it 3 blocks before you re-pushed into the back of a van. You're staying here. That's kidnapping, Clara said, her voice rising. You're holding me hostage. I am keeping you alive, Vance corrected her. There is a difference. A hostage is a tool used for leverage. You are an anomaly that I am choosing to shelter until I neutralize the threat outside. If you leave, you die. If you stay, you live. It's a very simple equation. Clara stared at him, her chest heaving. You re-talking about my life like it's a math problem. Everything is a math problem, Miss Miller, Vance said, turning toward the window. Some just have higher stakes. By 4:30 a.m. The city below was a sprawling grid of orange and white lights, quiet under the autumn fog. Clara couldn't sleep. She sat on the edge of the massive sofa, wrapped in her own arms, staring out at the skyscrapers. The door to the penthouse clicked open. Vance walked in. His white shirt was stained with a dark smudge near the cuff oil. Or maybe something else. He looked older in the pale dawn light. He walked to the window, standing a few feet away from her. He didn't look at her. He looked at the city. Pilsen, Vance said suddenly. Clara blinked. What? Your driver's license, Vance said. The address is listed in Pilsen. Before that, Bridgeport. Yes, I grew up in Little Village, Vance said, his voice low, almost reflective. 20 minutes west of your dad's place. Same broken sidewalks, same smell of diesel from the industrial corridors. Clara looked at his profile against the glass. You don't sound like you belong there anymore. Nobody belongs there, Vance said. You either die there, or you build a wall high enough that the noise can't reach you. He didn't say anything else. He walked over to his desk in the corner of the room, opened his laptop and began typing. The rhythmic, steady clicking of the keys was the only sound in the penthouse. Clara's eyelids grew heavy, the warmth of the room, the hot broth, and the sheer exhaustion of the last 12 hours finally caught up to her. She curled her legs up onto the sofa, her head resting on the leather arm. When she woke up at 7:00 a.m., the sun was hitting the glass, blinding and bright. Vance was still at his desk. He hadn't changed his clothes, he hadn't moved. But over Clara's shoulders, tucked carefully around her neck, was a heavy, dark gray cashmere blanket. It smelled faintly of cedarwood and cold air. She pulled it tighter around herself, staring at his back. The monster had a blanket, and for the first time, Clara felt the terrifying realization that she was no longer sure who she was supposed to be afraid of. By the third day, the penthouse had become an ecosystem of silent rules. Clara learned that Vance didn't speak before 8:00 a.m. He would walk into the kitchen, his hair damp from the shower, pour 2 cups of black coffee, and slide one across the island toward her. He didn't ask if she wanted it. He didn't check if she needed sugar. He just knew she drank it black, because he had watched her habits for 48 hours. She also learned that Gary Boyd wasn't just a bodyguard. He was a machine with a pulse. He spent hours stripping and cleaning his weapon on the dining table, his movements mechanical, precise, and entirely devoid of emotion. On the afternoon of the third day, Gary walked into the living room, his jaw tight, His left forearm was wrapped in a bloody paper towel. What happened? Clara asked, standing up from the sofa. Her medical instincts overrode her fear before she could think about it. Nothing, Gary grunted, trying to bypass her toward the bathroom. A piece of trim in the garage. That's not a trim scrape, Clara said, stepping into his path. That S a jagged laceration from a broken window, and it S pumping bright red blood. If you don't dress that properly, you're going to get an infection that'll rot your arm off before Silas Vance even gets a shot at you. Sit down. Gary stared at her. He was a foot taller than her and packed with muscle. But Clara didn't back down. She had stared down drug-fueled gangbangers in the ER. A grumpy enforcer didn't intimidate her. Gary looked at Vance, who was watching from the doorway of his office. Vance gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Gary sighed and sat at the dining table. Clara walked into the kitchen, gathered the medical supplies she had demanded Vance buy the day before, and set to work. Her hands were incredibly fast, efficient, and gentle. She cleaned the wound with antiseptic, her fingers moving with a rhythmic certainty that calmed the room. You re-fast, Gary muttered, his voice dropping its defensive edge. You learn to be fast when you have 6 people bleeding out in the waiting room and only 2 nurses on shift, Clara said, pulling a suture needle through his skin. The county doesn't give us luxury, Gary. We work with what we have. Vance watched her from the shadows of the corridor. He didn't say a word, but his eyes followed every movement of her hands. He wasn't looking at her as a captive anymore. He was looking at her as a force. At 3:14 a.m. that night, the rules broke. Clara woke up to a sound. It wasn't a loud crash, but a low, rhythmic thudding coming from the long hallway that led to the master bedrooms. It sounded like someone trying to breathe through a closed throat. She slipped out of bed, her bare feet silent on the marble. She walked down the dark corridor, following the sound until she reached the expansive glass gallery. Vance Collins was sitting on the floor. His back was pressed against the concrete wall. His knees were pulled up to his chest. His hands clenched into fists so tight, his knuckles were white. His shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, his chest heaving in rapid, shallow hitches. His eyes were wide, staring at the floor 3 feet in front of him. But he wasn't seeing the room. He was looking at a ghost. Clara stopped. She recognized the look instantly. It was a severe PTSD flashback, a profound acute panic response. She had seen it in combat veterans, in car crash survivors, in people who had watched their world burn. She didn't rush toward him. If you startle a man who lives by the gun during a flashback, he will kill you by instinct. Instead, she slowly sank to her knees about 4 feet away from him. She kept her hands visible, resting them on her thighs. She didn't touch him. She just let her weight settle onto the floor. Vance, she said. Her voice was low, rhythmic, and incredibly steady, the exact tone she used to anchor patients who were slipping away. Vance, look at my hands. You're in the penthouse on Wacker Drive. The year is 2026. The doors are locked. You safe. Vance's head snapped up. His eyes were bloodshot, his pupils dilated. He looked wild, like a trapped animal, completely stripped of his architect persona. He sat on the floor. Vance rasped, his voice cracked and dry. The blood, it's us moving under the door. I can get it off my shoes. There's no blood on the floor, Vance, Clara said softly. Her voice an unwavering anchor. Look at the marble. It's white. It's clean. Breathe with me. In for 4 seconds. Out for 4. She took a deep, exaggerated breath, letting him hear the rhythm of it. Vance stared at her chest, his own breathing raggedly trying to match hers. For 10 minutes. The only sound in the glass gallery was the synchronized rising and falling of their breath. Slowly, the tension left Vance's shoulders. He leaned his head back against the concrete wall, letting out a long, ragged exhale. He looked smaller now, stripped of the myth that surrounded his name. My uncle. Vance whispered into the dark. God didn't look at her. But Gad didn't tell her to leave either. I was 14. He sat at our kitchen table in Little Village. He drank my father's coffee. Then he pulled a .38 from his coat and put 2 rounds in my father's chest because of a territorial dispute over a shipping dock. I was standing by the refrigerator. I had a glass of milk in my hand. I didn't move. I didn't scream. I just watched my father empty out onto the linoleum. Clara kept her hands on her thighs. She felt a cold ache in her chest for the 14-year-old boy who had died in that kitchen. "You were 14, Vance," she said. Her voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. "A child cannot stop a grown man with a firearm. What happened in that kitchen wasn't your failure. It was a crime committed against you." Vance turned his head, his dark eyes fixing onto hers. The absolute control was gone, replaced by a raw, painful question. "I built this whole thing," he said, gesturing faintly to the room, to the city outside. "Every contract, every building, every laundered dollar. I built it so nobody could ever walk into my room and change my life again. I became the man who holds the knife." "You built a cage, Vance," Clara said cleanly. "You've worn this armor of absolute control for 28 years because you think it keeps everyone alive. But you aren't protecting these people, Vance. You're just controlling the variables of your own terror. A life lived in a fortress is still a life lived in a prison. You re-punishing yourself for surviving." Vance stared at her for a long time. The silence between them wasn't cold anymore. It was heavy with the weight of a truth he had spent 3 decades running from. "You talk too much, Nurse Miller," he said softly, but the edge was completely gone from his voice. "It is part of the service," Clara said, offering a tiny, fragile smile. She stood up slowly, her joints popping in the quiet night. She walked back to her room, leaving him there in the moonlight. But as she lay back down under the heavy cashmere blanket, she realized the terrifying truth. The monster wasn't a monster at all. He was just a hurt child who had grown up to build a city out of his own scars. The next morning, the fragile peace shattered. At noon, the private elevator chimed. A man stepped out into the penthouse. He looked like Vance, but younger. His hair styled too perfectly, his suit a little too loud, his eyes shifting around the room with an anxious, twitchy energy. Cole Collins, Vance's younger brother. He didn't see Clara sitting in the recessed library nook. He walked straight up to Vance, who was standing by the kitchen island. "Vance, we have a problem," Cole said, his voice high, vibrating with panic. "Silas is pushing hard on the Southside warehouses. The docks are frozen. The logistics guys are refusing to move the cargo until you sign off on the new distribution agreements. We losing 300 grand a day. The agreements are flawed." "Cole," Vance said, his voice flat, his coffee mug steady in his hand. "Silas is overreaching. If I sign those papers, we cede 40% of the logistics infrastructure to his shell companies. It's a trap. We need the cash flow, Vance," Cole shouted, his face turning a mottled red. "You sitting up here in your tower, playing the philosopher while the streets are burning. Just sign the damn papers." Vance didn't yell back. He set his mug down with that slow, deliberate precision Clara had grown to recognize. He looked at his younger brother, with an expression that looked remarkably like pity. "I designed the architecture, Cole," Vance said quietly. "You just manage the maintenance. Go back to the office. I'll handle Silas." Cole's fists clenched at his sides. He looked like he wanted to strike his brother, but the sheer physical presence of Vance kept him frozen. He turned on his heel, marching back toward the elevator. As the doors began to close, Cole's eyes darted across the room, locking onto Clara sitting in the shadows of the library. He didn't look angry to see her. He looked calculating, his eyes narrowed, analyzing her presence, weighing her like a piece of meat on a scale. The elevator doors slid shut. Clara stepped out of the library, her chest tight. She looked at Vance, who was staring at the closed elevator doors, his jaw set back into its rigid, stony mask. "Your brother," Clara said, her voice careful. "He doesn't smell like fear, Vance." Vance turned to look at her. "What does he smell like?" "Desperation," Clara said, her eyes wide. "And in my line of work, desperate people are the ones who make the most fatal mistakes. He is going to do something reckless, Vance, and you won't be able to calculate the variable when he does." The video arrived on Vance's phone at exactly 4:12 in the afternoon. The penthouse was quiet until the notification chimed. Vance didn't reach for the device immediately. He finished typing a line on his laptop, closed the screen with a muted click, and then picked up the phone. Clara watched him from the kitchen counter. She was folding a set of clean medical towels she had asked Gary to source for her. She had learned to read the minute shifts in Vance's posture. He didn't tense. He didn't curse. But the skin around his jaw tightened, the muscle pulsing once under the white scar. Gary, Vance said. He didn't raise his voice, but Gary appeared from the hallway within 4 seconds. Vance turned the screen toward his right-hand man. Clara stepped closer, her nursing instincts sensing the sudden drop in the room's atmospheric pressure. The video was low resolution, shot from a distance. It showed a man sitting in a dark, mahogany-paneled office, Silas Vance. He was 50 years old, his silver hair combed back severely, his face lined with the sharp, aristocratic creases of a man who had never done manual labor but had ordered a great deal of violence. Dominic, excuse me, Vance. Silas's voice came through the small speaker, dry and reedy, like paper rubbing together. It has been too long since we looked at the ledger together. Your father took a lot of things from my family 28 years ago. He took properties, he took docks, he took pride. You inherited his empire, Vance, but you also inherited his debt, and it's time to collect. The camera panned down. It wasn't showing Silas anymore. It was a live-streamed photograph. The lighting was unmistakable, the pale, green-hued fluorescent glow of a hospital ward. It showed an old man sleeping in a railed bed, an oxygen cannula under his nose, a thin white blanket pulled up to his chin. Arthur Miller. The angle of the shot was from a building directly opposite the third-floor window of the Cook County Oncology Unit. Close. Close enough to see the rhythmic rise and fall of her father's chest. Close enough to show a crosshair, if the photographer had wanted to draw one. Clara dropped the towel in her hand. The world around her seemed to tilt, the white marble beneath her feet turning to liquid ice. "Dad," she whispered, her hands flying to her throat. Vance didn't look at her panic. He didn't offer a comforting word because he knew comfort was an illusion that cost people their lives. "Gary," Vance said, his voice dropping into that terrifying flat register. "Move Squad 2 to Cook County Hospital right now. Secure the third floor. No sirens, no uniforms. They establish a perimeter outside room 314. They don't talk to the hospital staff. They just stay between that window and Arthur Miller. Go." Gary nodded once and vanished down the private elevator, his radio already glued to his lower lip. Clara lunged across the counter, grabbing Vance's forearm. Her fingers dug into his muscle, hard enough to leave marks. "He knows where my father is. He has had him targeted this whole time. The debt. Collins Capital buying my dad's medical bills. It wasn't a coincidence, was it?" Vance looked down at her fingers on his arm, then up into her eyes. He didn't pull away. He didn't lie. "The acquisition of the Bridgeport medical debt portfolios was handled by Cole's division 6 months ago," Vance said cleanly. "I didn't know your father's name until you walked into my office with that USB drive 3 days ago, Clara. But Silas knew. He's been tracking the variables of my brother's transactions for a year. He used your father's debt as a tripwire. He waited for someone to trip it." Clara let go of him, taking a step back, her head shaking. "So I am here because your family is messy. My father is in a crosshair because your brother wanted to buy up a neighborhood." Vance stood up. He walked over to the glass wall, looking out at the gray Chicago skyline. The clouds were heavy, promising rain. "Yes," Vance said. He didn't sugarcoat it. "This is how the machinery works, Clara. People like Silas don't attack the center of the fortress first. They look for the small, unprotected gears at the bottom of the system, the working-class families, the debts, the properties that nobody with a lawyer cares about. They manipulate those gears until the whole machine jams. Your father isn't a target because of who he is. He's a target because he's a piece of reality that I chose to protect." Clara wiped a stray tear from her cheek, her teeth grinding together. "That's not protection, Vance. That's using him as an anchor to keep your ship from drifting. In my world, Clara, they are the same thing," Vance said quietly. By 6:00 p.m., the penthouse had been transformed into a tactical command post. 4 of Vance's captains sat around the marble dining table. They didn't look like movie gangsters. They wore tailored corporate suits, their laptops open, their fingers moving across spreadsheets that tracked shipping manifests, customs clearances, and commercial real estate titles. Clara sat in the recessed library nook, watching the proceedings. She was a trauma nurse. She understood hierarchy under pressure. But this was different. This was the deliberate, quiet orchestration of an economic war. "The Southside warehouses are locked down by the city building inspectors," one captain said, his voice tight. Silas paid off the zoning commissioner. They reclaiming structural violations on 3 of our main distribution hubs. We can move the gray market electronics out of Northwest Indiana without those hubs. Offer the commissioner double what Silas paid. Vance said from the head of the table. He hadn't sat down. He stood with his hands flat on the wood, leaning forward. Tell him if he doesn't sign the clearance certificates by midnight, the ledger in my possession will find its way to the federal prosecutor's desk via an anonymous server in Switzerland. He has 4 hours to decide if he wants a bigger house or a federal prison cell. The captain nodded, his fingers flying across his keyboard. Vance moved through the logistics with cold, mathematical efficiency. He didn't yell. He didn't call for blood. He treated Silas' offensive like a structural flaw in a high-rise building, something to be reinforced, balanced, and neutralized through pressure. Clara watched him, and for the first time, she understood his street name, the architect. He didn't fight with his fists. He fought with the gravity of the system he had spent 28 years designing. He understood that in modern America, real power didn't belong to the man with the biggest gun. It belonged to the man who owned the land beneath the gun. At 9:30 p.m., the building shook. It wasn't a bomb, it was a physical breach. A muffled, low-frequency thud echoed through the elevator shaft, followed by the rapid, sharp crack 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 of suppressed firearms from the lower levels. The captains at the table didn't panic. They closed their laptops by instinct and stood up, moving toward the reinforced safe room behind the kitchen pantry. Gary Boyd appeared at the main entrance, his weapon drawn, his breathing steady but shallow. 3 shooters bypassed the secondary garage gate. Boss. They used a hijacked maintenance vehicle. They aren't trying to take the tower. It's a probing action. Silas wants to see how fast our tactical unit responds to a breach on Wacker Drive. Clean them up, Gary, Vance said. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't move from his position by the desk. Don't let any of them leave the basement alive. If Silas wants data, give him 3 bodies to analyze. Gary nodded and slid back into the elevator. Clara stood by the library wall, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had spent 12 years dealing with the aftermath of bullets, the torn flesh, the shattered bones, the smell of burnt copper in the trauma bay. But she had always been the one behind the safety of the hospital glass. Now, the violence was happening 500 feet below her shoes. 10 minutes later, the elevator doors opened again. Gary walked out. His gray jacket was torn at the shoulder, and his breathing was heavy. He carried a small black medical kit. They're done, Gary said, looking at Vance. But one of them had a localized jammer. It took out our external communication grid for 4 minutes before we dropped him. Vance turned to Clara. Gary's shoulder needs attention. Use the kit. Clara didn't hesitate. She walked over to the dining table, opening the black case. Her hands were cold, but as soon as her fingers touched the sterile packaging of the gauze and the antiseptic, her professional mind took over. The fear receded, replaced by the rhythmic, clinical focus that had defined her adult life. She peeled back Gary's shirt. It wasn't a bullet wound. It was a deep, jagged laceration from a shattered piece of structural glass. "You lucky," Clara said, her voice dropping into her professional cadence as she cleaned the blood away. 2 inches to the left and this would have severed your deltoid tendon. You'd have lost function in your left hand. Lucky is my middle name. Doc. Gary grunted, his jaw tight as the alcohol hit the cut. I'm a nurse, Gary. Don't insult my promotion, she said, her fingers moving with rapid, beautiful precision as she began to thread the suture needle. She pulled the skin together, tying the knots with the effortless speed of someone who had done it 10,000 times. Vance watched her from the edge of the table. He didn't look at Gary's wound. He looked at Clara's face, the absolute focus in her eyes, the absence of tremor in her fingers, the quiet, fierce authority she carried when she was in her element. You don't shake, Vance observed quietly. People who shake in my line of work end up killing the person they trying to save. Mr. Collins, Clara said, snipping the thread with a pair of surgical scissors. We don't have room for nerves when the clock is ticking. She finished the dressing, taping it down cleanly. She looked at Gary, then turned her head to look directly at Vance. Ray Delgado, she said, her voice dropping the professional tone, becoming hard and direct. My friend from Logan Square, the coder. Gary said Silas's men took him. Where is he? Vance. Vance didn't answer immediately. He looked at the medical kit on the table, then up at her face. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating, until the look in his eyes told her everything she didn't want to hear. The fifth day began with a compromise that felt like a trap. At 9:00 a.m., Vance walked into the kitchen, his coat already on. He didn't have his coffee mug. He looked at Clara, who was sitting by the window, her knees pulled to her chest. Gary is taking you to Cook County, Vance said. Clara's head snapped up. What? Your father's chemotherapy cycle finishes at noon, Vance said, his voice flat and businesslike. You've been in this penthouse for over 100 hours. Your psychological metrics are degrading. You need to see him. Gary will handle the security logistics. You have 45 minutes at the hospital. No detours, no exceptions. Clara stood up, her heart lifting for a fraction of a second before her natural suspicion returned. Why now? Yesterday this building was under siege. The 3 bodies we pulled out of the garage last night belonged to Silas's primary tactical cell, Vance explained, adjusting his leather gloves. He's restructuring his perimeter. He won't expect me to move you during a transition phase. It says a calculated window of volatility. Use it. 10 minutes later, she was in the back of a reinforced black SUV. Gary at the wheel. The city outside looked different through the thick, ballistic glass faster, louder, completely oblivious to the shadow war being fought in its financial high-rises. Clara watched the people on the sidewalks of the near west side, carrying their groceries, waiting for buses, living lives that didn't require an armed escort to visit a sick relative. She envied them so much it tasted like ash in her mouth. The oncology ward at Cook County Hospital smelled of old floor wax, rubbing alcohol, and the distinct, heavy sadness of a place where people ran out of time. Arthur Miller looked smaller than he had 4 days ago. The chemotherapy had stripped the remaining color from his skin, leaving his face the texture of old parchment. But when Clara walked through the door, his faded blue eyes lit up with a sudden, fierce intelligence. Clara, he breathed, his voice like dry leaves. Hey, Dad, she whispered, rushing to the side of the bed and taking his thin, calloused hand in hers. His fingers were cold, his pulse weak but regular. How are you feeling? Did the nurses give you the anti-nausea meds I told them to? I'm fine, Mija, he said, using the old Spanish term of endearment her mother had taught him before she passed. He looked past her shoulder, his eyes locking onto Gary Boyd, who stood just inside the doorway, his back to the wall, his coat unbuttoned to allow easy access to his shoulder holster. Arthur's eyes narrowed. He had spent 40 years working in a diesel repair shop. He knew what a dangerous piece of machinery looked like. That man, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper as Clara adjusted his pillows. He's not from the hospital union. Clara, he's not one of your friends from the clinic. He's helping me. Dad, Clara said, keeping her voice low, her eyes fixed on her father's IV line to avoid his gaze. He is part of a security detail. Just until we get the paperwork sorted out with the insurance fund. Arthur pulled his hand back slightly, his grip tightening around hers with surprising strength. Don't lie to an old mechanic, Clara, he said, his voice shaking with a sudden quiet anger. Men who look like that don't protect people like us out of the goodness of their hearts. They re-guards, sweetheart. They re-protecting an investment. When a man like that enters your life, he doesn't just clear your debts, he buys your options. He decides when you walk, when you breathe, and when you smile. I didn't spend 40 years breaking my back in a shop just to see my daughter become the property of a Wacker drive suit. You look at me, Clara. Are you free? Clara looked at her father's face, the honest, deep lines of a life spent in manual labor. A life that had never traded its integrity for safety. She opened her mouth to speak, to tell him the lie that would keep his heart rate stable. But the words caught in her throat. I'm keeping you alive, Dad, she whispered. That's all that matters right now. Arthur looked away, his jaw trembling. Alive isn't the same as living. Clara, don't you ever forget that. The transition happened in the hallway outside room 314. Gary had stepped down the corridor to speak with one of the plainclothes guards near the elevators. Clara stood by the water fountain, her head pressed against the cool drywall, her father's words echoing in her skull like a siren. A woman in a standard blue nurse-esque scrub passed her. She was short, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, a clipboard held against her chest. She didn't look at Clara, but as she brushed past, her hand moved with the practiced speed of a pickpocket, dropping a thick, heavy manila envelope into the deep pocket of Clara's nursing jacket. By the time Clara turned around, the woman had vanished through the double doors of the pediatric wing. Clara's heart stopped. She slipped into the visitor's bathroom, locking the door behind her. Her hands were shaking so violently, she could barely open the metal clasp of the envelope. Inside were 3 high-contrast photographs and a single sheet of legal bond paper. The first photograph showed Vance Collins. He was younger, his hair shorter, sitting at a corner table at Gibson's Bar and Steakhouse downtown. Sitting across from him, raising a glass of wine with a wide, appreciative smile, was Silas Vance. The date stamped in the corner was clear. October 14, 2019, 7 years ago. They looked like partners celebrating a successful closing. The second photograph was a digital copy of a real estate development blueprint for the Bridgeport residential corridor. In the bottom right corner, under the heading Collins Capital Urban Renewal Project, was the specific parcel listing for her father's address on 31st Street. The date of the filing was 14 months ago, long before her father's debt had been transferred. The third photograph was the one that made her sick. It was shot from a high angle inside a damp concrete warehouse. A man was tied to a wooden chair under a single bare bulb. His face was swollen, covered in dark contusions, his head hanging low. Ray Delgado. On the concrete wall behind him, painted in white stenciled letters, was the corporate inventory code, CCG Logistics 4, Collins Capital Group. On the sheet of legal paper, a single line had been typed in black ink. The architect doesn't build shelters for civilians, Miss Miller. He builds traps. He bought your father's life so he could own your compliance. Ask him about the third warehouse. The drive back to the Wacker Drive Tower was a blur of gray concrete and red brake lights. Clara didn't speak. Gary checked his mirrors every 30 seconds, his hand resting on the center console, completely unaware of the radioactive material sitting in the pocket of his passenger's jacket. When the penthouse elevator doors slid open, Vance was standing by the marble island, 2 plates of salmon and wild rice already set out. The afternoon sun was cutting through the glass, casting long, sharp shadows across the floor. "How is your father's white blood cell count?" Vance asked without looking up. Clara walked into the kitchen. She didn't take off her coat. She reached into her pocket, pulled out the 3 photographs, and slammed them down onto the pristine marble counter, right between the 2 plates of food. Vance looked down. His expression didn't change. His dark eyes flicked across the images, the steakhouse, the blueprint, the bleeding face of Ray Delgado with the calm, analytical speed of a computer scanning a barcode. "Explain," Clara said. Her voice wasn't loud, it was a flat, vibrating line of pure, unadulterated rage. Vance slowly took off his reading glasses, folding them and placing them next to his plate. "Where did you get these?" "A nurse at Cook County," Clara said, her chest heaving against her scrubs. "A real nurse, Vance, not a guard with a medical license. Look at the photos. That's you and Silas. You told me you were at war with him." "We are," Vance said quietly, you smiling in the picture. "Vance, you look like family." "We are family, Clara," Vance said, his voice dropping into that low, heavy register that usually silenced rooms. "That photo was taken during the October Accord 7 years ago. Silas was attempting to liquidate our logistics network through a crooked state audit. I sat at that table to buy time while Gary found the auditor's offshore accounts. I smiled because it was cheaper than a street war that would have cost 20 lives. It was an execution disguised as a dinner. And the blueprint." Clara pointed to the second picture, her finger digging into the paper. "Your company planned to demolish my dad's house over a year ago. You targeted his debt because you wanted that land for your commercial warehouse expansion." Vance looked at the blueprint, his eyes narrowing slightly. For a fraction of a second, Clara saw a shadow pass over his face, not guilt, but a sudden, icy realizations. I didn't authorize this development file, Vance said slowly. His fingers reached out, tracing the digital signature block at the bottom of the page. His hand stayed there, the tendons in his wrist tightening until his skin turned white. This signature, it's not mine. It's a corporate proxy stamp. Authorized by the Vice President of Logistics. Clara stared at him, the breath catching in her throat as the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Cole, Vance repeated, his voice dropping to a whisper that sounded like death itself. Before Clara could speak, the private security console on the wall let out a series of rapid, high-pitched chimes. The red emergency light began to pulse against the white marble ceiling. Gary Boyd's voice came through the speaker, ragged, breathless, and laced with an emotion Clara had never heard from him before. Boss, we've been blindsided. Cole just checked into Silas's private estate in Lake Forest. He took the master server decryption keys with him. Our entire financial grid. It's open, Vance, every account, every shell company, every name in the ledger. He's handing him the keys to the kingdom. The alarm didn't stop. It pulsed against the white marble walls of the penthouse, a rhythmic, crimson heartbeat that turned the luxury into a slaughterhouse. Vance didn't look at the flashing red light. He didn't look at the intercom speaker where Gary's voice was still crackling through the static. He stood completely still, his eyes fixed on the blueprint of Clara's neighborhood, his finger resting right over his brother's proxy signature, Vance. Gary's voice came through again, harder this time. The federal servers are going to flag the data migration in 20 minutes. If Cole hands Silas those keys, the prosecutors won't need an anonymous tip. They have the whole architecture. Assemble the extraction team, Gary, Vance said. His voice was a flat line, no anger, just the cold, mechanical engine of a man adjusting a blueprint. Meet me in the lower bay in 5. He turned back to Clara. The sun was setting over the lake, throwing long, bloody streaks of light across her face. She hadn't moved. She was still holding the photograph of her friend, Ray Delgado, her knuckles white against the paper. The photos, Clara said, her voice shaking but quiet. The warehouse with the inventory code. That's your property, Vance. Ray is in your house. It's a logistics hub in Calumet City, Vance said, stepping toward her. It's registered under a subsidiary Cole managed until 3 months ago. I didn't put your friend there, Clara, but my brother did. He has been constructing this trap for a year. He used your father's debt to bring you here. Because he knew if you had the ledger, I would have to protect you. I would have to lock down the system. He needed me distracted so he could clear the offshore accounts without my eyes on the terminal. Clara looked at him, her chest heaving against her scrubs. She felt the cold, hard weight of a truth she had been trying to deny since the first night. He hadn't hunted her. He had been targeted just like she had. You retelling me your brother sold out my family just to steal your company. He didn't sell you out to steal it, Vance said, his face inches from hers. He sold us both out to Silas because he wanted to survive the collapse. He thinks if he gives Silas the keys, Silas will let him keep a piece of the wreckage. He reached for his leather coat on the chair. Clara stepped into his path, her hands flat against his chest. She could feel the rapid, heavy thudding of his heart beneath his shirt. It was the same frantic rhythm she had felt during his flashback on the floor. "You going to kill him," she said. It wasn't a question. "I am going to secure the asset, Clara. Stop using corporate words," she shouted, her voice finally breaking, tears spilling over her lashes. "You know what makes me sick, Vance? It's not just the guns. It's that you think you can manage human lives like they re-rose on a spreadsheet. You think because you paid off my dad's bill, you bought the right to decide when I breathe, when I go to the hospital, and who I trust. That's not protection, Vance. It's control. And when you take away a person's right to choose their own risks, you aren't saving them. You're just holding the leash instead of the executioner." Vance stopped. His coat hung from his hand, halfway to his shoulder. He looked down at her small, pale hands against his dark shirt. The silence in the room stretched out, heavy and suffocating, louder than the alarm. "I don't know any other way, Clara," he said. His voice was very low, almost a whisper, the baritone cracking slightly at the edges. "I was 14 when the world showed me what happens when you don't control the room. You die on the floor while someone else drinks your coffee. I spent 28 years building this tower so nobody could ever make a choice for me again. I didn't learn how to respect freedom. Clara. I learned how to survive captivity. Clara looked up into his eyes. The monster was gone. The architect was gone. There was just a man, standing in the ruins of his own fortress, looking at her with a raw, terrifying honesty that cut deeper than any blade. Then learn now, she said softly. Let me go to the hospital. Let me stay with my father, alone. Without your guards. Prove to me you know the difference between a sanctuary and a prison. Vance closed his eyes for 2 seconds. When he opened them, the cold steel was back. But there was a subtle, painful fracture behind it. Gary will drop you at the secondary entrance of Cook County, Vance said, his voice flat. The perimeter teams will be withdrawn. You will be entirely on your own, Miss Miller. If Silas men find you before I neutralize the server, you will have to rely on your own choices. I've been relying on them my whole life, Clara said, stepping back. I'll take my chances. The drive to the hospital was a silent execution. Gary kept his eyes on the road. His jaw clenched so hard, the muscles in his neck looked like wire cables. He didn't check the rearview mirror for Silas Hitman. He checked it for Vance's orders, but the radio stayed dead. When the SUV pulled up to the curb near the emergency bay entrance of Cook County, Gary didn't get out to open her door. He just unlocked the electronic toggle from the console. Nurse Miller, Gary said, his voice rough. He didn't turn his head to look at her, the boss. He doesn't do this. He doesn't let variables walk out the door. If you think you're smart because you talked him into this, you're wrong. You just took away his shield. I didn't take away anything, Gary, Clara said, grabbing her medical kit from the seat. I just asked for my life back. Yeah. Gary grunted, his fingers tightening on the steering wheel. Let's see what you do with it. She stepped out into the cold Chicago rain. The door slammed behind her, and the black SUV melted into the gray Wacker Drive traffic within seconds. Clara stood on the sidewalk, the water soaking through her thin nursing jacket, her breath coming in short, white plumes. She was free. The cage was gone. But as she walked through the sliding glass doors of the ER, past the familiar smell of antiseptic and the low hum of the triage desk, she didn't feel relief. She felt a cold, hollow ache in her stomach. She felt the weight of the choice she had just demanded. She took the service stairs up to the third floor, avoiding the main elevators. The hallway of the oncology unit was quiet, the afternoon shift change in full progress. She walked toward room 314, her heart drumming against her ribs. She opened the door. The room was empty. The sheets on her father's bed were stripped down to the blue plastic mattress. The IV pole was bare. The oxygen monitor was turned off, its screen dark and dead. Clara dropped her medical kit. The plastic case cracked on the linoleum floor, spilling gauze and tape across her shoes. Arthur Miller, a voice spoke from behind her. Clara turned around, her breath catching. A tall man in a dark blue security uniform was standing in the doorway. He wasn't one of Vance's men. He had a gold badge pinned to his chest, but his eyes were too bright, too focused on her hands. He was transferred 10 minutes ago. Miss Miller, the man said. He offered a short, professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. A private ambulance. An urgent directive from the Collins Capital Medical Board. They said you were expecting us. Clara took a step back, her back hitting the bare metal frame of her father's bed. Her phone was gone. Her protection was gone. She had asked for the right to choose her own risks, and the world had answered by taking everything she had left. The man in the uniform reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black smartphone. He slid the screen open and held it out toward her. The display showed a video feed. Her father was sitting in the back of a moving vehicle, his head leaning against the glass, an oxygen tank between his knees. Standing right behind him, his hand resting casually on the old man's shoulder, was Silas Vance. The phone let out a short beep, switching to a text interface. A single message sat on the screen, written in all capital letters, "Touch her again, and I will burn Chicago to the ground with you in it." Below the quote, Silas had added his own note. "The architect talks a good game, Miss Miller, but he's currently 3 miles away, watching his brother bleed in a warehouse. If you want your father to see tomorrow morning, you walk out to the ambulance bay, right now. Don't look back. Don't call for help. Let's see if your choices can save him. Clara looked at the screen, then at the man in the uniform. Her hands stopped shaking. The terror receded, replaced by a cold, clinical clarity that had been forged in 12 years of trauma wards. Let's go, she said. The world didn't end with a bang. It ended with the sound of a heavy steel door locking from the outside. Clara sat on a wooden crate in the center of the dark room. Her hands weren't tied, but her wrists were cold. Her skin covered in goosebumps from the damp chill of the Calumet City shipping terminal. The room was a standard logistics office, 4 concrete walls, a single desk with a dead computer monitor, and a high, small window covered in rusty iron bars. A single bare bulb hung from a frayed wire in the ceiling, casting long, jittery shadows across the floor. She was an ER nurse. The first rule of survival under trauma was to catalog the environment. She looked down at her body, no major contusions. Her head throbbed slightly from the chemical smell of the rag they had pressed over her mouth in the ambulance bay. But her pupils were reacting to the light. Her pulse was steady at 85 beats per minute. She looked at the room. 3 steps to the desk. 5 steps to the door. The hinge on the lower part of the steel frame was rusted, showing a small gap of orange light from the warehouse floor outside. She could hear the low, mechanical drone of a forklift somewhere in the distance, and the wet, heavy slap of the Calumet River against the concrete pilings below. She wasn't dead. If Silas had wanted to kill her, she would have stayed in the hospital basement. She was an asset, a variable in a calculation she didn't fully understand yet. The lock on the door turned with a heavy, metallic clunk. Silas Vance walked into the room. He had taken off his overcoat, wearing a dark gray wool suit that looked too expensive for the grease-stained floor. He carried a small, silver thermos and a paper cup. Setting them down on the desk with a quiet, domestic politeness, "Miss Miller," Silas said, his voice dry and measured. He pulled the wooden chair out from the desk and sat down opposite her, his knees nearly touching hers in the cramped space. "I apologize for the dampness. This facility hasn't been properly climate controlled since the city froze the assets 3 months ago." "Where is my father?" Clara asked. She didn't look at the water cup he was pouring. She looked at his throat, right where the carotid artery pulsed beneath his silk tie. "Arthur is in the secondary office downstairs," Silas said, capping the thermos. "He has his oxygen tank. He has his medication. I am not a monster, Miss Miller. I don't take pleasure in the discomfort of the elderly. My dispute is with the Collins name, not with the working class of Bridgeport." Clara let out a short, cold sound that was almost a laugh. "You kidnapped an old man from a cancer ward, Silas. Don't talk to me about your morals." Silas didn't get angry. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his legs, his fingers interlaced over his knee. "You think Vance Collins is different?" Silas asked softly. "You think because he gave you a cashmere blanket and wiped your medical bills? He's a savior. Let me tell you about the architecture of this city. Clara, 28 years ago, my family owned 40% of the commercial riverfront on the south side. We built the docks, we hired the teamsters, we paid the pensions. Vance's father, Antonio, wanted that infrastructure to move his contraband without paying our distribution fee. He didn't use a gun first. He used the banks. He bought up our commercial loans, squeezed our credit lines, and forced our tenants into bankruptcy. When my father went to his house in Little Village to ask for terms, Antonio had him beaten on the lawn in front of his neighbors. That's the legacy Vance Collins inherited, the armor he wears. It was forged out of the skin of my family." Clara looked at the old man's face. She saw the deep, bitter grooves around his mouth, the unmistakable markings of a man who had fed on his own hatred for 3 decades, until it became his only source of nutrition. "I know about the armor, Silas," Clara said, her voice steady and quiet in the dark room. "Vance told me how his father died. He told me about the kitchen floor. He carries that wound every single day of his life, but he says trying to dismantle it. He is trying to break the system. You re just trying to take his seat at the table so you can do the exact same thing to someone else's children." Silas's eyes narrowed, the polite mask slipping for a fraction of a second, revealing the ancient, ugly rot beneath. "He's not dismantling anything, Miss Miller. He is a Collins. It's in his blood to dominate the space. And right now, He is coming here because he thinks he can control this variable too. He stood up, picking up his thermos. He walked to the door, stopping with his hand on the metal handle. Your brother, Clara said before he could open it. Cole, where is he? Silas looked back over his shoulder, a cold, dry smile touching his lips. Cole learned the hard way that when you betray a king, you don't get to keep the crown. He asked downstairs. Miss Miller, waiting for his brother to see what happens when you build a house on a rotten foundation. The door slammed shut. The lock turned. Clara was alone again in the dark. But as the silence settled back into the concrete walls, her mind began to move with that rapid, structural efficiency she had learned from Vance. What do I have? She asked herself. She had her hands. She had her medical kit, which Silas Men had carelessly thrown into the corner of the room. She walked over to the plastic case, opening it quietly. The scissors were gone. The needles were gone. But they had missed a small bottle of high-concentration isopropyl alcohol and a box of heavy, zinc oxide adhesive tape. She looked at the desk. The wooden legs were old oak, attached to the top with standard hex screws that had rusted through from the river dampness. She grabbed the edge of the desk and pulled upward with all her weight. The wood groaned, the rusted screw stripping through the soft fiberboard with a sharp crack. One leg came free, a heavy, blunt club of solid oak with a jagged 2-inch iron bolt protruding from the top. She didn't try to smash the steel door. She knew that was what a captive would do. And Vance had told her, the only thing a man in control fears is a prisoner who refuses to play the role. She walked to the corner of the room, right beneath the hanging bare bulb, and took a deep, steady breath. She poured the isopropyl alcohol over her left sleeve, soaking the fabric, then reached up and shattered the light bulb with the wooden desk leg. The room plunged into absolute, pitch-black darkness. Clara quitted her breath, moving to the dead corner behind the door hinge. She held the heavy piece of wood in both hands, her fingers wrapped tightly around the grain. Her father was downstairs. Vance was on his way. The architecture of the night was shifting, and she was no longer waiting for someone else to sign the paperwork. Outside, the drone of the forklift suddenly stopped. A single, sharp pop echoed from the lower shipping bay, the distinct, muffled sound of a suppressed weapon hitting a concrete wall. Then another. Then the entire facility went dead quiet, the only sound the steady, wet slap of the river against the dark iron pilings below. Vance was in the house. The darkness in the logistics office wasn't empty, it was heavy. It was thick with the smell of spilled isopropyl alcohol, damp river silt, and the sharp, hot copper of adrenaline. Clara stood behind the door hinge. Her knees were slightly bent, her weight balanced on the balls of her feet. Her fingers were dug into the grain of the oak desk leg. The iron bolt at the end of the wood felt cold against her thumb. She didn't breathe through her nose. She kept her mouth slightly open, letting the air slide down her throat without a sound. In the ER, you learn to listen past the monitors. You listen for the change in a patient's rattle. You listen for the silence that means the heart has quit. Below her feet, the concrete floor shuddered. It wasn't a blast. It was a pressure drop. The ventilation system in the warehouse terminal had just cut out. The low, industrial hum of the facility died, replaced by the hollow, echoing vastness of 500,000 square feet of empty iron and concrete. Thump. A heavy body hitting the drywall on the other side of the partition. Then, the wet, ragged sound of a man trying to choke back his own air. Clack. The lock on her door didn't turn. It was blown. A short, suppressed burst from an automatic weapon shattered the electronic cylinder, the metal fragments ringing across the concrete like loose coins. The door swung inward, cutting through the dark. A silhouette filled the frame. Tall, wide, moving with a low, predatory center of gravity. The man had a weapon raised, the tactical light beneath the barrel slicing through the blackness of the room, missing Clara's corner by 6 inches. Clara didn't think about her father. She didn't think about the law. She thought about the trajectory of a blunt instrument against human bone. She swung the oak leg with both hands, using the rotation of her hips to drive the iron bolt directly into the side of the silhouette's knee. Crack. The patella shattered. The man let out a sharp, choked gasp, his leg buckling beneath him as he pitched forward onto the concrete. The weapon flew from his grip, skittering into the dark under the desk. Clara raised the wood for a second strike, her jaw locked, her eyes wide. Clara. The voice was a low, gravelly vibration that stopped her arm in mid-air. It wasn't the enforcer. Vance Collins was on one knee on the floor, his left hand clamping down on his manson, his breathing shallow and ragged. The tactical light from his fallen weapon illuminated his face. From below, the jagged white scar on his jaw was slick with rain and sweat, his white shirt torn open and soaked in a dark, spreading stain of crimson. Clara dropped the desk leg. The wood clattered away as she dropped to her knees beside him. Her fingers went directly to his neck, checking the corroded 80 beats. Fast, but strong. "You're shot," she whispered, her hands already tearing at the fabric of his shirt to see the damage. "Slightly," Vance rasped. Gann didn't flinch as her fingers pressed against his skin. "The entry wound is clean. It missed the liver. But the rib is splintered. It's not clean, Vance. You leaking bright arterial blood, and your breath is rattling on the left side. Your lung is compressing from the pressure." She reached into her pocket, pulling out the heavy zinc oxide tape she had salvaged from her kit. She ripped a wide strip with her teeth. Her movements mechanical, rapid, and brutal. She slapped the adhesive over the entry wound, creating a makeshift three-sided occlusive dressing the standard ER protocol for a sucking chest wound. Vance watched her face through the dim light of the floor lamp. His fingers closed around her wrist, his grip surprisingly tight for a man who was emptying out onto the concrete. "Arthur is downstairs," Vance said, his breath hitching as the tape sealed the air out. "Silas has him in the lower loading dock. Cole is there too. Silas is setting the perimeter to melt down the files. We have maybe 6 minutes before the federal task force hits the outer gate." Clara looked at his hand on her wrist, then down at the bloody gauze. "Why did you come alone, Vance? Where is Gary? Where are your teams?" "Gary is holding the service tunnel," Vance said, leaning his weight against her shoulder as he forced himself up onto his good leg. Gann used her body as a crutch, his breath hot against her ear. "I didn't bring an army, Clara, because an army creates a static line. Silas wanted a war on Wacker Drive. He doesn't know how to handle an engineer who comes through his own foundation, in a system under stress. You don't break the walls, you remove the load-bearing pillar. Silas is the pillar. If I take him down, the whole network dissolves before the feds can map the connections." Clara braced her shoulder under his arm, her small frame lifting his bulk with the practiced strength of a nurse who spent 12 hours a day moving dead weight. "You can't walk 3 blocks like this, Vance," she said, her voice hard, "let alone clear a loading dock. I don't need to walk 3 blocks." Vance whispered, pulling a small black semi-automatic from his waistband and sliding the bolt back with a sharp metallic clink. "I just need to reach the stairs." They moved down the secondary stairwell like two ghosts, slipping through a ribcage. The air grew colder as they descended toward the river level. The smell of diesel and old grease got stronger, mixed with the wet, rotten stench of stagnant harbor water. Vance's weight grew heavier with every step, his head dropping against her hair, his breathing becoming a rhythmic, wet click behind his teeth. At the bottom of the flight, the door opened into the massive, vaulted expanse of the main loading bay. The space was lit by high, sodium vapor lamps that cast a sickly orange glare over rows of shipping containers and stacked wooden pallets. In the center of the concrete floor, beneath a massive overhead crane, a silver Mercedes sedan sat with its doors open, its engine idling with a low, expensive purr. Arthur Miller was sitting in the passenger seat of the Mercedes. His head was back against the leather, his eyes closed, the thin plastic tube of his oxygen line running down to a portable green tank on the floor mat. He looked like an old man sleeping on a train. Standing 10 feet away from the car was Silas Vance. He held a small silver lighter in his hand, the flame dancing against the cold air as he watched a stack of manila folders burn inside a rusted iron barrel. And next to the barrel, on his knees, was Cole Collins. His face was unrecognizable, his expensive nose broken, his designer suit torn at the collar, his hands cuffed behind his back to an iron ring bolt in the concrete. "Vance," Cole sobbed, his voice echoing through the hollow iron roof as he heard their steps. "Vance, please. He is going to put me in the river." "I didn't give him all the codes, Vance, I swear to God. I kept the Switzerland accounts clear." Silas didn't turn around immediately. He snapped the lighter shut, the click distinct in the vast room. He picked up a heavy, black revolver from the top of the oil drum and turned slowly, his silver hair shining under the orange lamps. "You're late, architect," Silas said. He looked at Vance, then his eyes flicked down to Clara's bloody hands, and finally to the dark stain on Vance's shirt. "You're leaking. Your structural integrity is failing." Vance didn't answer. He let go of Clara's shoulder, stepping out into the open floor. He didn't raise his weapon. His arm hung at his side, his fingers loose around the grip. He looked like a man standing at a bus stop, completely at peace with the gravity of the room. "The server keys are already dead, Silas," Vance said. His voice was remarkably steady, though his chest rose and fell in short, painful hitches. "Gary wiped the primary terminal on Wacker Drive 3 minutes ago. The ledger you have in that barrel, it's just scrap paper. The federal agents outside don't need your evidence. They have the migration logs. They know exactly where your money sleeps." Silas's face didn't move. He raised the revolver, his arm perfectly level, the black barrel pointing directly at Vance's forehead. "Then we go down together, nephew," Silas said softly, "just like your father and mine." Clara didn't look at the gun. She looked at the floor beneath Silas's shoes. A wide, dark smear of hydraulic fluid from the overhead crane ran across the concrete, slick and wet under the orange light. She didn't ask Vance for permission. She didn't wait for a calculation. She grabbed the heavy black weapon that Vance had dropped during their descent and raised it with both hands. Her knuckles shook. Her shoulders burned. She had spent her entire adult life treating the holes that these pieces of iron left in human meat. She knew the exact velocity required to tear an artery. She knew the sound a skull made when the lead hit the bone. She didn't aim for Silas' heart. She didn't aim for his head. She aimed 3 inches below his knee, right where the leg joined the ankle above the slick oil patch. Boom. The sound in the enclosed concrete bay was deafening. A physical shockwave that rattled her teeth. The recoil slammed her wrists back, the smell of cordite filling her nose. Silas didn't scream. He let out a sharp, wet grunt as the bullet shattered his left tibia. His foot slipped on the hydraulic fluid, his balance vanishing instantly as his body pitched sideways. His revolver firing blindly into the iron roof as he hit the concrete. Vance didn't hesitate, despite the splintered rib. Despite the blood in his lung, he closed the distance between them in 3 long, staggering strides. He kicked the revolver from Silas' hand, his boot coming down hard on the old man's chest, pinning him to the floor. The room went dead quiet again, save for the low, expensive purr of the Mercedes engine. Clara dropped the gun. Her hands were vibrating so hard she could barely see her fingers. She walked toward the car, her legs like lead, her eyes fixed on the passenger seat where her father was slowly opening his eyes. "Clara," Arthur whispered, his hand reaching out toward the glass. "I'm here, Dad," she said, her voice cracking as she opened the door and pulled him into her arms. "I'm right here. It's over." Behind her, Vance Collins stood over his uncle, his weapon pointing down at the old man's face. He didn't shoot. He just stood there in the orange light, his chest heaving, his shadow stretching across the concrete like the blueprint of a building that had finally found its foundation. The extraction wasn't clean. By 5:12 a.m., the Calumet City terminal was surrounded by 24 federal vehicles, their blue and red lights turning the damp Chicago fog into a swirling neon circus. But the agents didn't storm the loading dock with rifles raised. They walked in with briefcases and clipboards. Vance Collins had signed the surrender of his corporate infrastructure 3 hours before he left Wacker Drive. The federal task force wasn't here to capture a warlord. They were here to receive an inheritance. Clara sat on the rear bumper of an ambulance, a rough gray blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her father was inside the vehicle, hooked up to a commercial oxygen monitor, his vitals stable. He was sleeping, his face peaceful under the steady rhythm of the machine. Vance stood 10 feet away, leaning against a concrete pillar. A federal medic had cut away his shirt, taping a heavy plastic chest seal over his ribs, but Gant had refused to get into a stretcher. He stood with his coat draped over his bare shoulders, his face pale, his dark eyes watching the federal agents wheel Silas Vance out on a gurney. Silas didn't look at his nephew. His leg was bound in a temporary splint, his face gray with shock and age. He looked smaller now, stripped of the concrete fortress of his logistics network. He was just an old convict, going back to the cell he had left 28 years ago. Vance. A voice called from the shadows near the loading bays. Cole Collins walked out. His hands were free now, the cuffs removed by the federal marshals, but his wrists were red and raw. He had a white bandage taped over his broken nose, his expensive suit ruined, his shoulders slumped like a beaten dog. He stopped 5 feet from his older brother. He didn't look at the federal agents. He looked at Vance's boots. The marshals said, "My corporate immunity holds," Cole whispered, his voice trembling against the cold morning air. "Because I turned over the decryption keys for the offshore accounts. They letting me take the secondary trust in Miami. I'm leaving Chicago on the 7:15 flight. Vance, I'm not coming back." Vance didn't move from the pillar. Gain looked at his younger brother, his face an unreadable mask of stone in shadow. "Why did you do it, Cole?" Vance asked. His voice was low, gravelly, stripped of the corporate authority he usually carried. It was the voice of the 14-year-old boy from the little village kitchen. "I gave you 30% of the equity. I gave you the logistics division. I built the wall high enough to keep you out of the line of fire." Cole let out a short, bitter sob, his hands flying to his face. "That's exactly what you did, Vance. You built a wall. You sat up on the 60th floor playing the Grandmaster. And you never looked down at me once. Every meeting, every contract, every dollar we moved, it was always the architect's design. I wasn't your partner, Vance. I was just the guy who cleaned up the grease after you finished drawing. I didn't want Silas money. I wanted to see you look at a blueprint that you didn't draw yourself. I wanted to see you lose control just once, so I could be the one to save the family." Vance didn't yell. He didn't strike him. He slowly let his weight slide off the concrete pillar. Standing straight in the cold light of the dawn, he walked up to his brother, his long strides slow and painful from the splintered rib. He stopped inches from Cole. He reached out his large, scarred hand resting on Cole's torn shoulder, not to choke him, but to hold him. "I was 42 years old before I realized something, Cole," Vance said softly, his voice vibrating in the quiet bay. "The walls I built, they didn't just keep the monsters out, they kept you in the dark. I thought because I was keeping you breathing, I was being a brother, but I wasn't. I was being a warden. I didn't give you a choice, Cole. And that is my failure as much as it is yours." Cole looked up, his eyes wide, his tears wetting the bandage on his nose. He searched his brother's face for the old steel, the calculations, the judgment, but he found nothing but a vast, tired mercy. "Go to Miami, Cole," Vance said, his hand sliding off his shoulder. "Take the trust. Build something that doesn't have my name on the foundation. Learn how to be a man instead of a shadow." Cole didn't say goodbye. He turned and walked away, his head down, his shoes clicking against the wet asphalt as he vanished into the fog toward the waiting federal transport. Clara watched him leave. She pulled the gray blanket tighter around her neck, her eyes shifting back to Vance. He was standing alone by the pillar again, his chest rising and falling in that short, shallow rhythm that meant the lung was struggling. She stood up from the ambulance bumper, her legs stiff from the cold, and walked over to him. She didn't ask for permission. She reached out, her fingers taking his pulse from his right wrist. 82, stable. "You need to get into the transport, Vance," she said, her voice dropping into her professional nurse cadence. "The chest seal is holding, but the internal bleeding will start again if your blood pressure spikes. The county trauma team is waiting for you." Vance looked down at her hands on his wrist. His skin was cold, covered in a fine layer of river gray, but his eyes were entirely clear. "Gary is gone, Clara," Vance said softly. Clara froze. Her fingers stayed on his pulse point. "What?" "The service tunnel," Vance said, looking out at the river. "Silas had a secondary team waiting by the drainage gate. Gary held them for 4 minutes until the marshals breached the perimeter. He took 3 rounds to the midline. He died in the ambulance on the way to Mercy Hospital." Clara closed her eyes. Her mind flashed to the dining table 3 days ago. Gary Boyd, his massive hands moving with mechanical precision as he cleaned his weapon, his rough voice telling her that Luck was his middle name. He hadn't been a monster either. He had just been another piece of the infrastructure, an anchor that had held Vance's ship in place until the storm took him. He told me to tell you something, Vance whispered. Gan looked down at her face, his eyes darker than she had ever seen them. Before he went under, he said, "Tell the nurse she is good. Tell her not to let you build another cage." Clara let out a long, shuddering breath, her forehead dropping against Vance's cold shoulder. She didn't cry for the Empire. She didn't cry for the money. She cried for the 45-year-old soldier who had spent his entire life protecting a fortress that had ultimately become his grave. Vance's right arm came up slowly, his large hand resting against the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her damp hair. He didn't pull her tight, his ribs wouldn't allow it, but he held her there against the cold morning air, his chest rising and falling against hers in that slow, mechanical rhythm of survival. "The federal prosecutors are going to file the asset forfeiture papers at noon," Vance said, his voice a low vibration against her ear. "The Wacker Drive tower belongs to the state now. The penthouse is sealed. I have an arraignment hearing in 60 days. Clara, I'm going to lose the license. I'm going to lose the capital. I am going to lose everything that defined my father's name." Clara pulled her head back, looking up into his pale, scarred face. She reached up, her fingers wiping a smudge of river silt from his jawline. "Good," she whispered, her voice fierce and steady. "You can to build a real life until you re-standing on the actual ground, Vance. The tower was just a monument to your fear. Let the feds have the concrete, let them have the ledger. You paid your father's debt today, Vance. And for the first time since you were 14 years old, you re-allowed to be an ordinary man." Vance Collins looked at her for a long time, the dawn light finally breaking through the Chicago fog, turning the gray river into a ribbon of pale, cold silver. He didn't smile. He didn't make a promise. But as the medics finally approached with the stretcher, he let go of her hand, his fingers leaving a faint, warm impression on her skin that didn't fade even after the ambulance doors slid shut. The glass on the 42nd floor was clean. It was the first thing Vance noticed. The federal cleaning crews had already cleared the heavy mahogany desks. They had packed the servers into black plastic crates. They had scraped the gold lettering off the double doors in the reception lobby. Collins Capital Group was a ghost. Vance stood by the window, his hands deep in the pockets of a pair of worn denim jeans. He wasn't wearing a tie. He wasn't wearing the gold cufflink with his father's initials. He wore a simple gray cotton shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing the thick, pale scar from the surgery on his splintered rib. 6 months had passed since the night at the Calumet terminal. The federal prosecutors had spent 180 days parsing the ledger. They had froze 98 corporate accounts. They had seized 12 commercial warehouses. In the end, because Vance had handed over the architecture before the first warrant was typed, the judge had handed down a 5-year probated sentence. No cell, no orange jumpsuit, just a lifetime ban from the financial sector and an order to surrender every asset linked to his father's name. The door behind him clicked open. Vance didn't turn around. He listened to the rhythm of the steps, light, crisp, the distinct, unhurried pace of rubber-soled nursing shoes. Clara Miller walked into the empty office. She carried a single cardboard box containing a few personal items she had left in the penthouse library, a couple of old medical journals, a silver pen her mother had given her, and the heavy cashmere blanket Vance had draped over her shoulders on her second night in captivity. "The marshals are waiting downstairs with the keys," Clara said. Her voice was a soft anchor in the vast, hollow room. "They need you to sign the final structural release for the title transfer." Vance looked at the reflection of the city in the glass. The Chicago summer was in full swing, the lake a brilliant, blinding blue under the morning sun. "It's smaller than I remembered," he murmured. "The city, the desk," Vance said, gesturing faintly to the bare floor where his mahogany table used to sit. "I spent 28 years believing that if that table was wide enough, the world couldn't reach me. Now it is gone, and the floor hasn't collapsed." Clara set her box down on the windowsill, stepping into his space. She didn't touch his hand immediately. She just stood beside him, her shoulder brushing his arm, looking out at the water. My father's white blood cell count came back from the lab this morning, she said quietly. The oncologist said the remission is holding. The new targeted therapy, the one funded by the blind trust you set up, it's working. Vance. He's walking 2 miles every morning now, without the tank. Vance turned his head, his dark eyes looking down at her face. The sharpness was still there in his jaw, the white scar prominent against his tanned skin. But the ice in his pupils had melted into something softer, something heavy with reality. I'm glad, Clara, he said. And for the first time in his life, the words didn't sound like a strategic negotiation. They sounded like a man speaking to his neighbor. I spent 6 months listening to federal lawyers talk about the valuation of my property, Vance said, his voice dropping into that low baritone. They kept using the word asset. They measured my life by the square footage of the warehouses and the balance of the offshore funds. But when I sat in that deposition chair, the only variable that mattered wasn't on their spreadsheets. It was the fact that an old machinist in Bridgeport was breathing without a machine because I chose to dismantle the machine that was crushing him. True power isn't the capacity to accumulate variables, Clara. It's the strength to surrender them when they start costing human lives. Clara reached out, her fingers sliding into her palm, warm against his calloused skin. You're a fast learner, Mr. Collins, she said. A tiny smile touching her lips. I had a very strict instructor, Vance replied, his fingers tightening around hers. Let's go sign the papers. I don't want to keep the government waiting for their concrete. 6 months later, the world was completely different color. The salt air of Beaufort, South Carolina, didn't smell like Chicago. It didn't have the grease, the exhaust, or the sharp, cold smell of coming snow. It smelled of marsh grass, wet sand, and the slow, heavy warmth of a southern autumn. The house was a small, white clapboard cottage sitting on 3 wooden pilings right at the edge of the tidal creek. The porch was covered in screened wire to keep the marsh mosquitoes out, and a pair of old rocking chairs sat by the door, their paint peeling from the salt. Vance Collins stood in the kitchen. He was barefoot, wearing an old pair of khaki shorts and a faded black t-shirt. The marble counters of Wacker Drive were gone, replaced by butcher block wood that had stains from coffee cups and grease from the stove. He was trying to cook breakfast. He had a cast iron skillet on the burner, a wooden spoon in his right hand, his brow furrowed as he watched 4 eggs scramble against the heat. He moved with a heavy, awkward caution, like an engineer trying to repair a watch with a sledgehammer. Clara walked out of the bedroom. Her hair was loose, falling over her shoulders in dark waves, her feet bare against the pine floor. She wore an oversized gray shirt that belonged to him, the hem hitting her mid-thigh. She stopped in the kitchen doorway, her arms crossed over her chest, watching the smoke rise from the pan. You re-burning the butter, Vance, she said. Her voice carried a soft, relaxed rhythm that had developed over half a year of sleeping past 5:00 a.m. Vance didn't lift his eyes from the eggs. The heat is at 40%. Clara, according to the recipe, the coagulation should take 3 minutes at this thermal level. Eggs don't read recipes, Vance. Clara laughed, stepping up behind him and taking the wooden spoon from his hand. She turned the gas toggle down to low, her fingers moving with that effortless, instinctive efficiency that defined her. You have to watch the edge. When the protein starts to curl, you lift the pan off the heat. You don't manage the temperature, you respond to the change. Vance stepped back, letting her take the wheel. He watched her hand move the skillet, his eyes following the curve of her neck, the quiet peace in her shoulders. I'm learning, Vance said softly. You're doing fine, she murmured. Flipping the eggs onto 2 white ceramic plates, she set them on the small wooden table by the window, where the morning sun was throwing gold squares across the floor. Vance didn't sit down immediately. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch. It wasn't the kind of jewelry box that came from a boutique on the Magnificent Mile. It was a simple drawstring bag made of rough blue canvas. He set it on the table next to her plate. Clara looked at the bag, then up at his face. Her heart skipped a beat, the old trauma response trying to flare up, but she forced it down. The air down here was too clean for fear. What's this? She asked. A structural amendment, Vance said. Clara opened the drawstring, tilting the bag until a silver band slid out onto the wood. It was a heavy, hand-forged piece of sterling silver. No diamonds, no platinum settings. The exterior was smooth, showing the tiny, regular hammer marks of the artisan who had beaten the metal into shape. Inside the band, carved in deep, clean block letters, was a single word: safe. Clara picked up the ring, her thumb tracing the interior engraving. The silver felt warm from being in his pocket. "I don't have a speech." "Clara," Vance said. He stood by the table, his arms hanging at his sides, completely exposed in the morning light. Gan didn't have a desk to lean on. Gan didn't have Gary standing by the door. For 28 years, I told myself that love was a vulnerability that would get the people around me killed. I thought if I let someone close enough to see the kitchen floor in Little Village, the walls would cave in. But you didn't look at the walls, Clara. You looked at the child inside them. You gave me back my name before the law took it. He stepped closer, his large hand coming up to touch her jawline, his thumb brushing the line of her cheek. "I'm not the architect anymore. Clara, I don't own the streets, and I don't control the variables. I am just a man with a scarred rib and a 5-year probation order. But I am asking you to stay here. Not because you have to, not because there's a threat outside, but because I want to spend the rest of my life learning how to build something that doesn't require a fortress to protect it." Clara looked at the ring in her hand, then up into his dark eyes. The tears came then, but they weren't the hot, bitter tears of the Cook County ER or the Calumet warehouse. They were clean, they were quiet. She slid the silver band onto her left ring finger. It fit perfectly, the heavy metal settling against her skin like a permanent foundation. "The eggs are getting cold. Vance," she whispered, her voice cracking as she pulled his head down to hers. "That S an acceptable variance." Vance murmured against her lips, his arms finally closing around her waist, pulling her small body against his chest until the rhythm of their breathing became a single, steady line in the quiet kitchen. September arrived with a high, pale blue sky and a breeze that turned the marsh grass from bright green to an old, deep gold. Arthur Miller sat in a low canvas chair on the sandy bank of the creek, a wide-brimmed straw hat shading his eyes. He had a small wooden block in his left hand and a pocket knife in his right, his calloused fingers shaving thin slivers of cedar onto the sand. He was whittling a small toy boat, his movements slow, rhythmic, and entirely unhurried. Beside his chair, a little girl with bright brown eyes and a thick tuft of dark hair was sitting in the mud, her small fingers digging a trench for a tiny pool of marsh water. She was 14 months old, and her name was Georgia. "Look, Pop Pop," she chirped, pointing her muddy finger at a blue crab skittering across the grass line. "I see him." "Georgia," Arthur said, his voice deep and steady, no longer carrying the thin, rattling hitch of the cancer. "He is just building his house. Leave him be." Vance stood on the back porch of the cottage, a mug of black coffee in his hand, watching them from behind the wire screen. His hair had grown a little longer, the gray at his temples showing silver under the coastal sun. His shoulders were loose, the tight, military rigidity completely gone from his posture. He looked like a man who spent his afternoons checking the tide charts instead of the stock tickers. Behind him, through the open kitchen window, the sound of Clara's voice came through the screen. She was on a speakerphone with the county health board, her voice crisp, professional, and full of that fierce, logical authority that had once terrified Gary Boyd. She was managing a new mobile immunization clinic for the seasonal workers in the low-country farming communities, a project funded by the clean interest from Vance S. Remaining Trust. She didn't work the night shift anymore. She didn't clean up the blood of gangbangers on Wacker Drive. She built networks of prevention, using her skills to keep people from ever needing the trauma bay. Vance listened to the steady, rhythmic cadence of her voice as she argued for a higher budget for the rural storage units. He smiled a real, wide smile that showed the small lines around his eyes. The kitchen door clicked open, and Clara stepped out onto the porch. Wiping her hands on a dish towel, she looked out at the creek, at her father, and at the little girl covered in marsh mud. She walked up behind Vance, her arms sliding around his waist, her head resting against the flat plane of his back, right over the scar on his rib. "Arthur is teaching Georgia how to sabotage the shoreline," Clara said against his shirt. "She's an engineer," Vance said, setting his coffee mug down on the wooden rail. He turned around in her embrace, his large hands coming down to rest on her waist. She understands that you have to clear the silt if you want the water to move. She looks like you when she frowns, Clara said, looking up into his face. That S, a structural defect, Vance murmured, leaning down to press his forehead against hers. Hopefully she inherits her mother's hands. The world has enough architects, Clara. It needs more nurses. Clara looked out at the water, the tide slowly rising, filling the dark trenches her daughter had dug in the sand. The river was moving, clean and bright under the southern sky, carrying the ruins of the old empire out to the deep, silent vastness of the sea. "We doing okay, Vance," she whispered, her fingers locking behind his back. "Yes," Vance said, his voice a low, peaceful vibration against the morning air. "The foundation is solid, Clara. The building is going to hold the opinions, actions, and decisions expressed by the characters in this story do not reflect the views or beliefs of the author. Certain scenes may contain dramatic situations, emotional conflict, or morally complex behavior intended solely to serve the fictional storyline and enhance the audience's viewing experience."
And as the tide rises over the quiet marshes of Beaufort, far away from the glass towers, frozen streets, and blood-stained concrete of Chicago, the story of Clara Miller and Vance Collins leaves us with a truth that is both painful and beautiful. A life built on control can never become a life of peace until someone is brave enough to tear down the walls. Vance Collins spent nearly 3 decades believing that power was the only language the world respected. After watching his father die on a kitchen floor when he was only 14, he built himself into the architect, a man who owned buildings, debts, ledgers, and people's fear. He thought that if he controlled every variable, no one could ever hurt him again. But what he really built was not a kingdom. It was a cage. Every contract, every shell company, every guarded elevator, every marble floor in that tower was just another brick in a prison made from trauma. Clara Miller entered that world not as a queen, not as a weapon, and not as a woman waiting to be saved. She entered it as a daughter trying to protect her sick father, as a nurse who understood the value of human life, and as a working woman who had been pushed to the edge by a system that treated illness like a business opportunity. Her father's cancer debt was not just a number on a page, it was the weight of an entire broken system pressing down on one family. And that is one of the first lessons this story gives us. When human suffering becomes a product, dignity becomes the first casualty. Clara was not fighting only for a house in Bridgeport. She was fighting for the right of ordinary people to survive without being swallowed by men who hide cruelty behind legal language and corporate seals. But Clara's true power was not in the USB drive. It was not in the ledger. It was not even in the gun she fired at Silas Vance. Her true power was her refusal to let fear turn her into someone else's property. Vance tried to protect her by controlling her. Silas tried to use her father to break her. Cole tried to turn her family into a piece of his betrayal. But Clara kept returning to one unshakable truth. Being alive is not the same as being free. Her father reminded her of that from his hospital bed. Protection that removes choice is still a cage. Safety that demands obedience is still captivity. And love that does not respect freedom is not love at all. That is why Clara changed Vance. She did not change him by begging him to become good. She changed him by forcing him to see the difference between shelter and ownership. She looked at the powerful man inside the fortress and saw the wounded boy who had mistaken control for survival. But she also refused to excuse him. She told him the truth no one else had the courage to say. If you take away a person's right to choose their own risks, you are not saving them. You are simply holding the leash instead of the executioner. That was the moment Vance began to understand that redemption is not about paying off a debt, saving one person, or defeating one enemy. Redemption is about surrendering the very power that allowed the harm to exist in the first place. Gary Boyd's sacrifice also gives this story one of its heaviest meanings. He was not a saint. I was not innocent of the world he served, but in the end, he used his final strength not to defend money, not to defend a tower, but to defend people. His last message to Clara was simple: do not let Vance build another cage. Those words became more than a warning. They became a moral inheritance. They reminded us that even loyal soldiers can see the truth before kings do. A fortress may feel necessary during war, but if it remains standing, after the war is over, it becomes a tomb for everyone inside it. Cole Collins' betrayal shows another side of broken power. He did not betray Vance only for money. He betrayed him because he had lived too long in someone else's shadow. He wanted to be seen, to matter, to prove that he could draw a blueprint of his own. But instead of building a life, he tried to destroy one. And that teaches us a hard lesson. Pain does not justify cruelty. Feeling invisible does not give us the right to harm the innocent. If we want freedom, we cannot steal it from someone else's suffering. We must build it with our own hands. By the end, Vance loses the tower, the title, the money, the licenses, and the empire that once defined his name. But he gains something far more valuable: the chance to become an ordinary man. And sometimes, that is the greatest victory a powerful man can ever achieve. To cook breakfast badly in a small kitchen, to live in a house without guards at the door, to watch a child dig channels in the marsh mud, to let love exist without turning it into a strategy. That is not weakness, that is peace.